Hello, in this video I'm going to talk to you about rhetorical choices. Now you all probably know what that second word means, choices, but the first word may or may not be familiar to you. The word rhetorical comes from the word rhetoric. And what does rhetoric mean? Rhetoric means the art of effective or persuasive speaking, especially the use of compositional techniques. And that phrase, compositional techniques, is a really important one because it is the techniques you are using when you are composing the text or the speech that you are giving, right? So what are you doing when you are composing it, right? And the phrase effective is important, right? Because the question is, what are you doing and is it effective? So when you are writing a speech, or do you pause for effect? Do you include a joke? When you're writing an essay, do you include outside research? How do you organize it? How long is it? Do you use metaphors? All of those things are compositional techniques that you are, or choices that you are making as you are composing your text or your speech, with the goal of being more effective, right? To get a better grade or to convince your audience or whatever. So again, rhetoric is the art of effective speaking, especially through these compositional techniques. So you'll hear people refer to rhetoric, but more commonly in classes like ENC 1101 and ENC 1102, you will hear teachers refer to rhetorical choices. And it's basically the same thing. A rhetorical choice is all of the things that a writer or speaker does when they are composing a text. And now I give students often this example. Imagine you're in a high school classroom and your teacher has just given everybody in the class the same prompt and you all have to write an essay. And the essay has to be about the same thing for all 30 of you. And you have an hour to write the essay and you have the same teacher, so the situation's the same. But one student decides to start their introduction with a quote. Another student in the class decides to start their introduction with a question, a rhetorical question. And a third student decides to start their introduction with an anecdote, a short story. Those three students had the exact same writing context, but all of them made different choices about how the essay should begin. And sometimes those choices are very, very consciously made, and sometimes they're kind of subconsciously made. We're not really thinking about it, we just make this choice. But it is still a choice because there were other ways to do it, right? And so when we are making those choices, we call them rhetorical choices. Now, importantly, thinking back to that definition, the question is, are these choices effective? So maybe you wrote an essay and you told a joke in the middle of an essay. And I say to myself, this is not an effective rhetorical choice because the essay was really sad, it was really serious, and you told a joke, and it just felt really inappropriate, and I don't think the choice was effective. Sometimes it might be really effective, like you gave us a quote in the middle of an essay you wrote, and I thought that quote really got my attention. It was a great quote, and I think including this quote was a great choice. It was an effective rhetorical choice. Or maybe you're telling a story and you're deliberately telling the story out of order to increase suspense, but really telling it out of order just confuses me. And so then I might say, I don't think this rhetorical choice was very effective. The organization did really confuse me, right? And importantly, as a side note, whenever we're doing revision, either through peer reviews or your instructor giving you feedback on a draft, really what they're doing is saying that your rhetorical choices are good or they could be better. Because sometimes maybe the quote is not very good at this moment, but if you moved it to a different place, it would be more effective. Or, I didn't think your essay was very good, but if you took out some of the jokes, that would really improve your essay, right? So what they're really telling you is there are different rhetorical choices you could make that would make this essay more effective, right? And that's what revision is thinking about how could we have made better choices or more effective choices. Now, ultimately, rhetoric is not what we are arguing, but how we are arguing it. So if you're writing an essay, going back to that example, you're writing a timed essay in the high school about whether or not school uniforms should be used or whether or not guns should be outlawed or whatever you guys are all writing about. When I look at rhetoric or your rhetorical choices, I am not looking at what you are arguing. I really agreed with you. I do think that mass shootings have gotten out of control, or I really agree with you. I do think we should have uniforms in schools, but I really liked your point where you argued. No. That's not rhetoric. That is not appropriate topic of conversation when we are talking about rhetoric. Instead, what we are focusing on when we are talking about rhetoric and rhetorical choices is how did you write that essay? Where did you include a joke? When did you include a short story? Did you include a bulleted list? Did you have everything organized in a way that made sense? Were the words you used effective? How are you creating this essay or this speech or whatever it is you're creating? And was that effective? And that is what we mean by rhetoric. So again, not what you are arguing, but how you are arguing it is what we're talking about when we talk about rhetoric and rhetorical choices. Now, when we make rhetorical choices and we're asking ourselves, are these choices effective? We have to consider a few things in order to understand that better. The first thing is, who is the audience? Because the effectiveness of a rhetorical choice must be understood in relation to the audience. Because, for example, if I'm writing for my teacher, I may write in a way that is very effective for my teacher, but if I was writing that same way for my best friend, it might be ineffective because I'm closer to my best friend, we have a different way of speaking, and there are things I'm going to do with my best friend that I would not do when I was writing for my teacher, right? So if I say this rhetorical choice was ineffective, like for example, you're using a lot of slang and talking really informally in this essay, that's not a very effective rhetorical choice in an essay that's meant for your teacher. However, using slang and talking really informally about TV shows might be very appropriate for something that you're writing for your best friend. And then consider how you might write for your best friend, like you're writing a letter to your best friend or a text message to your best friend. How would you phrase it? What would you include in that would be different than if you were writing a text message that someone you really, really didn't like was going to read? You know, how much more guarded would you be? How much more careful would you be about what you said? What would you write differently, right? And so rhetorical choices may be effective in one situation based on one audience, but ineffective in a different situation based on a different audience. Again, another example would be writing for children versus writing for adults, right? We make different rhetorical choices, and they will be effective based on who the audience is. A second question we have to ask ourselves when deciding if a rhetorical choice is effective is, what is the genre? So the effectiveness of a rhetorical choice has to be understood in relation to what kind of text am I trying to write. For example, if I'm writing a text message, I might include emojis and a GIF, and that would be really appropriate rhetorical choices for a text message, right? It is very appropriate to include emojis in a text message. But if I'm writing an essay for school, it would be a very ineffective rhetorical choice to include emojis. And then a PowerPoint, right? A PowerPoint, you use bulleted lists, you have incomplete sentences, but that would not be appropriate for an essay at school. So having bulleted lists and incomplete sentences makes total sense, and a PowerPoint is a very good rhetorical choice, would be a very bad rhetorical choice for an essay at school. And then you also need to consider the purpose. When you're asking if a rhetorical choice was effective, you need to think about what the purpose was. What was the writer, you or whoever's text you're looking at, what was the writer's goal, right? And by purpose, we mean both goal and motivation, you know, are you trying to break up with someone? Are you trying to explain the causes of World War II? Are you trying to entertain a friend? Or is this supposed to be an analysis? What are you trying to do? And there's a very big difference between trying to inform someone and trying to persuade someone, and that will affect the rhetorical choices you make. So why are you writing? And that will affect what is an effective rhetorical choice. Okay, so back to my example about a joke that was inappropriate, right? That a joke that is inappropriate because you're trying to explain something really sad and you include a joke, then you are not paying attention to your purpose here, and that joke was therefore inappropriate. Whereas if my purpose had been to entertain, then a joke would be very, very appropriate because my purpose is different. Okay? So we understand now, hopefully, what rhetoric is and what a rhetorical choice is, which are basically the same thing. But another phrase you may hear is rhetorical analysis. Now, when you hear the phrase a rhetorical analysis, really what you're being asked to do is analyze whether or not someone else's choices were effective. So the rhetorical analysis is when you analyze the choices that a writer or speaker makes in the construction of a text. And again, you are not analyzing their content. You're not analyzing their argument to see if you agree with them or not. You are not looking at the points they made. You are instead looking at what compositional techniques they made, what choices they made as they were creating their speech or text. So, for example, in a rhetorical analysis, you might look at the president's speech, and you may be asked to look at whether or not the president made effective choices. Was it effective when he made a joke here? Was it effective how quickly he was talking or how slowly he was talking? Was it effective that he led the audience in a chant, right? What choices was the speaker making in this speech, and were they effective or not? You could look at a commercial and the same thing. Images they use, colors they use, music in the background. Were these effective choices? We rhetorically analyze even movies all the time. And again, this is a perfect example of how we do not analyze the content. So we wouldn't say, oh, this movie, in a rhetorical analysis, we would not say, oh, this movie's about this guy, and then his father died, and then his girlfriend breaks up with him. No. That's the content. Instead, when we do a rhetorical analysis, we're asking ourselves, what was the directing like? What was the acting like? What were the special effects like? Was the way the story was out of order effective or not? Did that increase suspense or did that make the movie too confusing? We're thinking about what the writer or author, or in the case of a movie, a director, did to make the movie or text or speech effective or not. All of those choices. And when we sit and look at those choices, and we decide if somebody else's choices are effective or not, that is a rhetorical analysis. Okay? Now, you may be asked to write a rhetorical analysis. And when you are asked to write a rhetorical analysis, one thing you have to do first is go through the text, maybe more than once, and identify different choices that you think the author made. And you need to examine those choices closely and think about whether or not they were effective. And once you decide whether they were effective or not, then you can begin writing about it. And when you write about a rhetorical choice, if you are ever asked to write for a teacher about whether or not a choice was effective, the first thing you have to do is decide whether or not the choice was effective. And when you're writing about it, though, you need to point to an example in the text of that thing. So, for example, if I'm saying, oh, the joke this author told was really effective, the reader may not have caught the joke, and they're like, what joke, right? So I have to tell them where the joke was or what the joke was so that they understand what I'm talking about when I say it was effective. And then I have to explain why it was effective or not. Okay, why was the joke told at that moment the right choice to make, and why was it effective, okay? So you're going to go ahead and explain, I think the author's use of metaphors was really effective. For example, the author gives this metaphor, explain what the metaphor was, and then explain why that metaphor was effective. So it's important to, as you're doing a rhetorical analysis, constantly be saying whether it was effective or not, constantly giving us examples of things you're pointing out, and constantly explaining why you think that thing was effective or not. And that's a rhetorical analysis. Again, we do this really informally through the revision process on peer reviews and stuff. When you say, this sentence was confusing to me because, you are effectively saying this was not an effective rhetorical choice because it was confusing, and here's why it was confusing and ineffective. So it's important that you do that to a degree in any rhetorical analysis you write. Okay? Now, just briefly, students always ask me for a list of what counts as a rhetorical choice. There is an infinite list of things that count as a rhetorical choice. Here's a brief list, okay? When we're talking about rhetoric, we could be talking about organization, the examples the author gave, the quotes they used, the outside research they used, the word choices they had, the tone, the formatting. Did they include bullet points? Did they include an image? Did they tell a story? Did they include rhetorical questions? Do they repeat anything? Do they have any allusions to other things? Do they have metaphors? Are there any cliffhangers? But this is such a very, very small list compared to the huge list there is. The bottom line is that a rhetorical choice, when you're doing a rhetorical analysis and you want to pick something that you think the author made as a rhetorical choice, the rhetorical choice is anything that you notice that the author did and you can provide an example of. Again, you need to provide an example and explain why it was effective or not, but you are going to, anything that you think the author did and you can provide an example of is a valid thing that you can talk about in a rhetorical analysis or when you are looking at somebody else's use of rhetoric. There is no definitive list of if it's not on this list, it doesn't count as rhetoric. No, that's not how it works. Anything the author is doing that you can give an example of and explain why it was effective or not, that is an example of a rhetorical choice. Okay? So hopefully this clarifies rhetorical choices for you. And good luck.